The spare chair at Hazel Sutton's table had never once been moved since the night she dragged it in from the cold and set it beside the hearth, and every person in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, knew it was not there for sitting. It was there for remembering. The year was 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Chisholm Trail like a bead on a string, dusty and loud, and brimming with the kind of life that exhausted a person by sundown. Cattle drovers came through in the spring and summer, filling the saloons and churning the main street into mud that sucked at boot heels. Merchants made their fortunes and their ruin in equal measure. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, and with it came a new breed of settler men with ledgers instead of guns, women with hat boxes instead of bonnets. But underneath all the noise and progress, Caldwell was still a town where everybody knew everybody's grief, and Hazel Sutton's grief was no secret at all. Her husband, Thomas Sutton, had died in the spring of 1875, 3 years before the story truly begins. He had been a wheat farmer, a gentle man with wide shoulders and patient eyes, and he had loved Hazel with the steady, unspectacular devotion of a man who knew what he had. They had been married for 7 years when the fever took him. It came on fast and burned him hollow in 12 days, and by the time Hazel had buried him on the small rise behind their farmhouse beneath the cottonwood that had been their wedding tree, she was 30 years old and utterly alone. Their daughter, Clara, was 5 at the time. She had her father's quiet eyes and her mother's dark hair, and she had asked Hazel, in the frank way of young children, whether Papa would be coming back for supper. Hazel had sat down on the porch steps and pulled Clara into her lap and pressed her face into the child's soft hair and told her no. And then she had gone inside and put a third plate on the table anyway, because she could not yet bring herself not to. The plate eventually came away, but the chair stayed. Hazel was not a maudlin woman. She was practical in the way the frontier demanded. She kept the farm running with the help of her neighbor, old Ezra Potts, who was too ancient for his own fields and glad enough for the work. She sold her wheat and her eggs. She bartered with the mercantile. She taught Clara her letters by lamplight and took her to the church on Sunday, even though the preacher made her feel like a half-finished sentence. She wore her grief the way she wore her boots, sensibly, and without ornamentation. But every evening, when she set the table for herself and Clara, she pulled that third chair out from its place against the wall and set it at the table's far end, opposite her own seat. She never put a plate there. She never set a fork. She simply set the chair there, as though the table were a conversation waiting to include someone who had not yet arrived. Clara had grown accustomed to it the way children grow accustomed to all adult peculiarities, without question and without fuss. The neighbors talked, of course. Mabel Greer, who lived a quarter-mile down the road and had never in her life kept a thought unexpressed, had told Hazel 3 separate times that keeping a dead man's chair at her table was not healthy. Hazel had listened politely each time and refilled Mabel's tea and changed the subject, and the chair had stayed exactly where it was. It was not about Thomas, precisely. Or rather, it was about Thomas in the way that the shadow of a tree is about the tree, not the thing itself but the shape left behind. The chair was about the fact that Hazel believed, in some quiet chamber of herself that she never showed anyone, that a table with a spare chair was a table that still had room for something, and she was not yet ready to stop believing that. She was 33 years old in the autumn of 1878, and she was doing fine. That was what she told herself on the morning of October the 14th, when the stranger rode in off the Chisholm Trail on a roan horse that had clearly been ridden too hard and too long. She saw him from the farmhouse porch, where she was turning the butter churn, and she watched him pull up at the edge of her fence line with the look of a man who was either very lost or very tired, and by the cut of his shoulders she decided it was probably both. He was perhaps 35, lean but not spare, with the kind of weathered face that came not from age but from years spent outdoors in all seasons. He wore a trail coat the color of a dead creek bed, a battered hat pulled low against the October wind, and the look about him of a man who had been riding alone long enough that he had forgotten how to compose his face for company. He sat the horse loosely, the way men do when they are too exhausted for posture, and his eyes, when they found Hazel on the porch, were a pale and startling gray. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and roughened, like a road that had seen a lot of use. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was hoping you might be able to tell me how far it is to the town proper." Hazel set down the churn handle and straightened. 3 miles east," she said. "Follow the fence line to the road, then keep south until you cross the creek. You'll see the water tower." He nodded slowly, as though processing the information required some effort. His horse shifted beneath him, and he steadied it with a tired hand. Hazel noticed the horse's flanks were tucked and its ears were low. "Your horse needs water," she said. It was not an invitation so much as a statement of fact, delivered in the same direct tone she used for everything. He looked down at the horse with what seemed like genuine contrition. "She does," he agreed. "I pushed her harder than I should have. Is there a place I might water her before I ride on?" Hazel studied him for a moment. He did not look dangerous. He looked, if she were being honest, like a man who needed a hot meal and about 16 hours of sleep, which she recognized because she had looked the same way after Thomas died and the harvest had still needed bringing in regardless. "Trough's around the back," she said. "You're welcome to use it." "Much obliged, ma'am." He dismounted slowly, and she noticed the slight catch in his movement as his boots hit the ground, the stiffness of a man who had been in the saddle for a very long time. He led his horse around the side of the house without being told, which she appreciated. Men who listened the first time were not common in her experience. She went back to her churning, but she listened to the sounds of the horse drinking from the trough, and the quiet words the man murmured to the animal, too low to make out. After a while, Clara appeared in the doorway behind her, round-faced and curious, pressing her nose against the screen. "Who is that man, Mama?" she asked. "A traveler," Hazel said, "looking for the town. He has a pretty horse." "He does. Go finish your arithmetic, please." Clara disappeared, her footsteps retreating across the floorboards with the particular reluctance of a child who wanted to stay and watch. The man came back around the front of the house leading his horse, who was walking with noticeably more energy. He stopped at the gate and touched his hat again. "Thank you kindly," he said. "You've saved me a great deal of trouble." "It's only water," Hazel said. "Most kindnesses are only small things," he replied, and then he seemed almost surprised at himself for saying it, as though the words had come out before he had thought to stop them. Hazel looked at him more squarely then. "What's your business in Caldwell?" she asked. It was a direct question, perhaps more direct than was polite, but she had lived alone long enough that social niceties sometimes slipped her. He did not seem offended. "I've been hired on as deputy sheriff," he said. "The town sent word to Wichita that they were looking for a man," I answered. "Deputy to Sheriff Briggs." "That's right. Briggs is a reasonable man," Hazel said, which was her version of a recommendation. "You'll do all right." He smiled then, just slightly, a careful, contained smile, as though he had a limited supply and was measuring it out. "I hope so," he said. "My name is Elias Carver." "Hazel Sutton," she replied. He nodded. She nodded. And then he mounted his horse and rode east along the fence line toward the road. And she watched him go with the churn handle still in her hand, and thought nothing in particular about it. Or rather, she told herself she thought nothing in particular about it. Caldwell in October was not a restful place. The last of the season's cattle drives were coming through, and the drovers were men who had been on the trail for months and were ready to spend their wages in ways that tended to make the sheriff's office very busy. Elias Carver walked into that situation with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen worse and did not intend to make a production of it. She heard about him before she saw him again. Mabel Greer came by on the Thursday of that week, ostensibly to return a pie tin, but actually to deliver intelligence. She sat at Hazel's kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee and began her report before she had even taken off her shawl. "There is a new deputy in town," she said, as though Hazel had not been the one to direct him there. "I know," Hazel said. "He stopped here for water." Mabel's eyes sharpened. "He came here. He was lost. I told him how to find the town." "Well," Mabel reconsidered her approach. "He is very capable from what my herald says. Broke up a fight at the Red Dog last night without drawing his gun, which apparently impressed everyone considerably. And he is from Missouri originally, but he has been all over. He worked as a drover himself for several years, and then did some work as a tracker up in Colorado. He looks like a man who has been a lot of places," Hazel said. "He is not married," Mabel said, with the studied casualness of a woman trying to appear disinterested. "I didn't ask," Hazel said. "I know you didn't ask. I am telling you." Hazel poured herself a coffee and sat down across the table and looked at Mabel with the patient expression she reserved for these conversations. "Mabel," she said, "I have butter to put up and a fence post that needs resetting before the ground freezes. I don't have room in my life for whatever thought you are presently nursing." "I am not nursing anything," Mabel said with great dignity. "I am simply reporting the news." The news, as Hazel found over the following weeks, was that Elias Carver was exceptionally good at his job and almost entirely invisible otherwise. He did not drink at the saloons. He did not frequent the card tables. He ate his meals at the boarding house run by the widow Fern Albright, who later told Hazel that he was the quietest boarder she had ever had. Polite, paid promptly, never left a mess, but that he sometimes sat on the front porch in the evening with a cup of coffee and looked at the sky the way a man looks at something he has lost. Hazel encountered him for the second time at the Mercantile on a gray November morning when she came in for her monthly provisions and found him at the counter buying a tin of boot wax and a length of rope. He turned when she came through the door, and his gray eyes recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. "Deputy Carver," she said, moving to the shelves to begin her list. "Settling in all right?" she asked, not because she was particularly curious, but because it was the kind of thing one asked. "Tolerably," he said. "It's a busier town than I expected." "The trail drives do that," she said. "They'll slow through December and you'll have more peace." He nodded, watching her work through her list with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had been managing alone for years. "How far is your farm from the town?" he asked. 3 miles west." She set a sack of flour on the counter. "Why?" "There was some trouble with fence cutting last month on the farms west of here," he said. "Some cattlemen who don't believe in the concept of boundaries. I have been riding that way a few times a week to make sure things are quiet." She looked at him then properly. "I hadn't heard about fence cutting," she said. "It was mostly the Haverson property and the old Crane place, but I'd advise you to check your lines if you haven't lately. Some of these late-season drovers have been taking liberties." "I'll look," she said. "Thank you for telling me." "Of course." He picked up his purchases and stepped back from the counter. "Have a good morning, Mrs. Sutton." "You as well." He went out, and the bell above the Mercantile door rang behind him, and Hazel stood at the counter and felt, for a moment, the particular sensation of having been looked at by someone who was actually seeing you rather than merely noting your presence. It was a small thing. She added a second tin of baking powder to her provisions and thought no more about it. She checked her fence lines when she got home. He had been right. 3 of her posts on the south edge had been pulled from the ground, and a section of wire had been cut and poorly rejoined. Elias Carver had noticed the kind of trouble that affected her livelihood without her even asking. She appreciated that in a way she could not quite articulate. December came in cold and swift, and the cattle drives stopped and the drovers went south or east, and Caldwell contracted into its winter self quieter, more insular, the world shrinking to the distance a person could walk in the snow. Hazel and Clara kept close to the farm, making the most of their stores and the small stove that Hazel kept fed with the wood she had spent September splitting. Clara had developed a passion for the penny novels that the Mercantile stocked, and Hazel read aloud to her every evening after supper, her voice steady and warm against the sound of the wind outside. Every night the chair sat at the end of the table. Clara, who was now 8 years old and full of the philosophical boldness of children that age, asked about it one December evening as Hazel was clearing the supper dishes. "Mama," she said, "who is that chair for?" Hazel wiped down the table in slow circles. "What do you mean?" "Well, it's always there," Clara said. "But nobody ever sits in it. It's not for Papa because Papa is in heaven, and it's not for anyone else. So who is it for?" Hazel set the cloth down and looked at the chair. The plain wooden chair with its slightly worn seat and its 4 sturdy legs, sitting there in the lamplight. "I suppose," she said slowly, "it is for whoever needs a seat at this table more than they know." Clara considered this with great seriousness. "That's a very peculiar answer," she said. "I know," Hazel said, "but it's the honest one." She did not sleep particularly well that night, which she attributed to the cold and not to anything else. January was the hardest month. It always was. The farm felt very isolated in January, and Hazel's nearest neighbor, Ezra Potts, was laid up with a cough that had turned into something more serious, so she did not even have the small companionship of his occasional visits. She drove the wagon into town every 2 weeks for provisions, and those trips became the scaffolding around which the rest of her days were arranged. It was on one of these January trips, on a brittle cold afternoon when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the road was hard as iron under the wagon wheels, that she found trouble. She had just left the mercantile and was loading her provisions into the wagon bed, when she heard a commotion from the direction of the livery stable, raised voices, and then the distinct sound of something heavy being knocked over. She turned to see 3 men she did not recognize clustered around the stable entrance, and between them and the stable door, standing his ground with the quiet of a man who has chosen to be calm, was Elias Carver. The men were drovers who had apparently not gone south with the others, or had come back, or had never left, and they were the worse for drink even at 3 in the afternoon. One of them had his hand at his belt, and the other 2 were circling wide, which was the kind of move that made Hazel's stomach drop. She did not think about what she did next. She simply did it. She walked directly toward the group, moving with such deliberate normalcy that 2 of the men actually stopped moving to look at her. She addressed Elias directly. "Deputy," she said, in the same steady voice she used to discuss provisions, "Mr. Foster says the part you ordered for the county office came in on the Thursday freight. He's been holding it for you. It was an absolute invention. There was no part. There was no order." But Elias Carver looked at her for one beat, understood everything, and stepped smoothly in her direction, putting himself beside her and half a step in front. "Thank you, Mrs. Sutton," he said. "Gentlemen, we're done here. There is a warm fire at the jail, and I am happy to show you to it if you can't find your way back to your horses." The shift in dynamic was complete enough that 2 of the 3 men seemed to reconsidering their situation. The third, the one with his hand at his belt, was still working up to something when a second figure appeared from the direction of the sheriff's office, Sheriff Briggs himself, a broad and unhurried man who moved with the authority of someone who had nothing to prove. The third man's hand came away from his belt. 5 minutes later, the 3 drovers were on their way out of town with very clear instructions about when they would be welcomed back, which was never. Hazel was standing beside her wagon, checking the security of her load with perhaps more attention than it required. Elias came to stand beside the wagon. He was not precisely shaking, but she could see in the set of his jaw the particular held-together quality of a man who had been in a tight spot and kept his nerve and was now letting himself breathe again. "That was a clever thing you did," he said. "It seemed useful," she said. "It was." He paused. "You weren't frightened." "I was very frightened," she said. "But frightened and useful are not mutually exclusive in my experience." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite name. It was something between surprise and recognition, the look of someone encountering, unexpectedly, a landscape they had always somehow known existed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Did they trouble you at any point?" "They hadn't noticed me yet," she said. "I was simply in the vicinity." "Well," He removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, which was slightly too long for tidiness. "Thank you, Mrs. Sutton. I am more grateful than I know how to say." "Then don't try to say it," she said, and climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Good afternoon, Deputy." She did not look back as she drove out, but she felt his eyes on her until the wagon turned the corner at the end of the main street. That night, as she dished out the supper and Clara chattered about the cat who had gotten into the woodpile and made a nest, Hazel looked at the spare chair at the far end of the table. She could not have said precisely what she felt. It was something like a question forming, not yet fully worded, not yet ready to be examined, but present. She put the question away and passed Clara the corn bread. February arrived, and with it a letter from Hazel's sister in Abilene, who wrote to say that their mother had taken ill and could Hazel come. It was not the kind of letter that permitted a no, but it was also not the kind of situation that permitted simply closing up the farm and leaving. She spent 3 days arranging things, asking Ezra's son, young Caleb, to look in on the livestock, making sure her stores were in order, making arrangements for Clara to stay with the Greers, since the journey was not a good one for a child in February. She ran into Elias at the post office when she was mailing her reply to her sister, and because she was preoccupied with logistics she told him more than she might have otherwise: the trip to Abilene, the ill mother, the 3 or 4 weeks she expected to be away. He listened with full attention. "Do you have someone reliable looking after the farm?" he asked. "Caleb Potts," she said. "He is young but capable." "I'll ride by when I can," he said. "Make sure things are in order." She looked at him. "That's beyond what you're required to do," she said. "I know," he said simply. She was quiet a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with more weight than the 2 words typically carried. He touched his hat. "Safe travels, Mrs. Sutton." She was gone for 3 weeks. Her mother recovered slowly, irritably, with the tenacity of a woman who had survived too many winters to let an illness have the final word. Hazel arranged a neighbor to help with her care, kissed her mother's papery cheek, and made the journey back to Caldwell in a cold rain that turned the roads to soup. She came home to find the farm in good order, better order than she had left it. In fact, the fence she had been meaning to mend on the east side had been mended. The woodpile, which she had worried was getting low, had been restacked and topped up. Caleb Potts had done his part, certainly, but when she asked him about the woodpile he looked slightly shifty and admitted that the deputy had come by twice and done some work while he was there. Hazel stood in her kitchen and looked around at everything in its place and felt something shift very quietly inside her, like a door opening in a house that has been shut up for a long time. She made a pot of stew that evening, a real one, not the thin kind she made when she was tired, and when Clara was in bed and the night was quiet around the farmhouse, she sat at the table and looked at the spare chair and thought about Elias Carver. Not about what he looked like or what he said, but about the quality of his attention, the way he listened, the way he acted on what he heard, the way he had stood his ground in front of the livery stable with the careful calm of a man who chose not to be brutal even when brute force was an available option. Thomas had been gentle too, but Thomas had been a certain kind of gentle, warm and immediate and sunny, like a June morning. Elias was gentle in a different way, the way a river is gentle when it runs deep, where the surface is still and the current is everything. She noticed she was comparing them and stopped herself. She washed her bowl and went to bed. March came in wet and generous, and the farm began to wake up with it. The wheat she had planted in the fall sent up its first green spears, and the hens recommenced laying with an enthusiasm that made Hazel laugh out loud one morning when she went to the coop and found more eggs than she had seen in months. Clara came home from school one afternoon having traded a girl from town for a paper-wrapped packet of seeds, Sweet Williams, the kind with the spiky petals in pink and white, and they planted them together along the south side of the porch on a Saturday afternoon, Clara pressing each seed in with the serious concentration of a surgeon. It was on that same Saturday, in the late afternoon with the sun going long and golden across the fields, that Elias rode out. He came along the fence line the same way he had the first time, but this time he reined in at the gate and called a greeting before coming any closer, which she appreciated. She was on the porch brushing the dirt from her hands when he dismounted. "I was riding the western properties," he said. "Wanted to make sure the fence cutting hadn't resumed." "I hadn't noticed any new trouble," she said. "Come in. I'll make coffee." She said it before she had quite decided to say it, and she heard herself say it and kept moving toward the door, because the alternative was to stand there and make something awkward out of something that was simply hospitality. He tied his horse at the fence post and came up the porch steps with his hat in his hands, the way a man does when he is being careful not to presume. Clara appeared in the doorway, looked at Elias with enormous eyes, and said, "You are the deputy." "I am," he said, crouching down to her level with the naturalness of a man who had spent time around children. "And you must be Miss Clara." "My mama told me about you," Clara said. Hazel from the kitchen closed her eyes briefly. "She said you fixed the fence," Clara continued with the blissful indifference of a child to social delicacy, "and that you are reliable." "That is very high praise," Elias said. "I'll try to deserve it." He sat at the kitchen table, at the side, not at the far end, and drank his coffee with both hands around the cup in the way of a man who has drunk a lot of coffee outdoors and formed the habit of warming his hands. Clara interrogated him with relentless curiosity about his horse. Her name was Biscuit, which surprised Hazel into a genuine laugh. Where he had come from, he described Missouri with a kind of quiet affection that suggested he missed it while knowing he could not go back. And whether he had ever caught an actual outlaw. He had, several times, but he described it without drama, as though it were simply part of the work, which she thought more impressive than if he had made a story of it. Hazel mostly listened, refilling cups and moving around the kitchen, and discovered that she liked the sound of his voice in her house. It was a settled sound, not loud, not commanding, simply present. The way good weather is present. When Clara was sent to wash up before supper, Hazel turned from the stove to find Elias looking at the spare chair at the end of the table. He said nothing. He did not ask, but she saw him notice it with the thoughtfulness of a man who filed things away without making a show of doing so. "I should get back," he said, rising and carrying his cup to the counter without being asked, which was the kind of small thing that registered. "Thank you for the coffee. And for—" He stopped. "For what?" she asked. "For the company," he said. "It has been a while since I sat at someone's table, and it felt like something other than eating." She looked at him steadily. "You are welcome here," she said. "When you are in the area." He held her gaze for a moment. "I am much obliged, Mrs. Sutton." "Hazel," she said. She said it because it seemed right to say it, and because if she was going to invite a man to sit at her table she might as well invite him to use her name. He absorbed this. The careful smile appeared again. "Hazel," he said. "Elias." "Good evening, Elias." "Good evening." He went out into the golden March evening, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride away and thought, well then. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. Not always with a stated reason. Sometimes he brought something useful that the mercantile had had on order for her, or he had news about something related to the farms in the area, and sometimes he came with nothing at all, just himself and the roan horse in the quiet manner, and she made coffee and they talked while Clara played or did her lessons, and the evening light moved across the kitchen floor, and Hazel noticed that the house felt different when he was in it. Bigger somehow, more inhabited. As though the rooms had been waiting for the right amount of sound. She talked to him about Thomas once, in April, when the cottonwood on the rise was leafing out, and she had gone up to tend the grave in the late afternoon. He had ridden out earlier, and when she came back down the hill she found him sitting on the porch steps talking to Clara about something she could not hear, and Clara was laughing, and the scene hit Hazel somewhere deep and undefended, and she sat on the bottom step and said, without quite planning to, that the cottonwood had been there when she and Thomas got married. Elias said, "What was he like?" And she told him. Not a performance of grief or a recitation of loss, but the actual man, Thomas who left his boots exactly wrong every time. Thomas who grew the straightest fence posts in the county because he was meticulous about everything. Thomas who sang very quietly to himself when he thought no one could hear him. Thomas who had been kind in the way that takes practice and intention. She talked for perhaps 15 minutes, and Elias listened with the full, uninterrupted attention of someone who understood that this was not a conversation to be managed but simply to be received. When she stopped, he said, "He sounds like a man who made the world better by being in it." "He did," she said. "Really did." There was a quiet between them that was not uncomfortable. The cottonwood rustled above the rise, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its two-note song, and Clara had gotten up and gone inside for something, and Hazel and Elias sat on the porch steps in the April light and breathed. "Do you want to tell me where you've been?" she asked finally. "Before Caldwell." He was quiet for a moment, not evasively, but in the way of someone deciding how much truth to offer. "I had a wife," he said. "Her name was Anna. She died in 1873 in a cholera outbreak in Missouri. We had been married 2 years." "I'm sorry," Hazel said, and meant it. "I left after that," he said. "I couldn't stay in the house. It was the right house, the right town, all the right things, but they were wrong without her. So I left and I worked droving, tracking whatever came, and I kept moving because moving seemed easier than stopping." "And then you stopped," she said. "And then I stopped," he agreed. He looked at the horizon. "I'm not sure I know how to be still yet, but I'm trying to learn." She looked at him, he looked at her. Something passed between them that was too large and too careful to be named yet, and both of them seemed to understand that, and both of them let it be. "Stay for supper," she said. He looked surprised, genuinely so, as though the words had arrived from a direction he had not anticipated. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am setting the table anyway," she said. "There is always enough." He stayed. She set the table, her place, Clara's place, and then she looked at the spare chair at the far end and felt the full weight of the moment. She pulled a plate from the shelf. She set it at the spare chair's place. She put a fork and a knife and a glass of water. She did this deliberately and quietly, and when she turned around, Elias was in the kitchen doorway, having come in to ask if he could help with anything, and he saw her setting that place, and something in his expression shifted like weather changing over a long plain. He said nothing. But he pulled the chair out and sat in it when she invited him to, and Clara took her own seat with the cheerful obliviousness of a child who had not registered the magnitude of what had just happened, and Hazel sat in her own chair at the other end, and the table felt complete for the first time in a very long time. They talked through supper about small things, Clara's school, the spring planting, a road improvement the town council was arguing about, a recipe for corn bread that Elias said he had gotten from a cook at a trail camp in Texas that involved rendered bacon, fat, and buttermilk. Clara demanded details. Elias demonstrated the recipe in description with great seriousness, and Clara listened with the gravity of a future baker. Hazel sat at her end of the table and ate her stew and watched this man at the spare chair's place, this careful and worn and quietly remarkable man, talking about corn bread with her daughter as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and she thought, "I have not been waiting without purpose after all." After supper, Clara was put to bed, and Hazel and Elias stood on the porch in the mild April night. The stars were extraordinary. She had always loved the Kansas sky in spring, the way it expanded overhead as though the world were opening up. "Thank you for supper," he said. "That was—" he stopped again. "Something," she offered. "Yes," he agreed, "something." He turned toward her, and in the starlight she could see the particular quality of his expression, the careful, wondering look of a man who has learned to be very cautious about hope but finds himself hoping anyway. "Hazel," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made it sound less like a word and more like a decision. "I know," she said, because she did know, and saying so was easier than pretending otherwise. "I don't want to be the wrong kind of presence in your life," he said. "You have built something here, you and Clara and this farm. I don't want to walk into that carelessly." "You have not been careless," she said. "You have been the opposite of careless." "I am not a certain man," he said. "I don't have a great deal to offer in terms of settled things." "I don't require settled things," she said. "I require honesty and steadiness and someone who listens when I speak." "Those I can provide," he said, with a quiet conviction that was more convincing than any declaration would have been. "Then provide them," she said, "and we will see what we become." He let out a slow breath. The careful smile came again, but larger this time, wide enough to change his whole face, to make him look younger and less braced against the world. "All right," he said. She reached out and put her hand briefly over his where it rested on the porch railing, and then withdrew it and went inside, because some moments needed to be left at exactly the right point, and she had always had good instincts about that. He rode back into town with the stars overhead and the April wind in his face, and she lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something she recognized. Not the consuming wildfire of first youth, but the steadier warmth of something built on truer ground. She had been cold for a long time. Not unhappy. She was careful not to conflate cold with unhappy, because she had been many things in the years since Thomas died, and most of them had been worthwhile. But cold in the specific way of someone without a partner, without the particular human warmth of someone who has chosen you. She was not cold now. May arrived, and the town of Caldwell continued to hum and crow as it always did, and Hazel Sutton was seen more frequently in town than she had been in previous years, and Elias Carver was seen with her often enough that the population of Caldwell, which had strong opinions about everything, formed equally strong opinions about this. Mabel Greer was so thoroughly satisfied with herself that she became, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, briefly speechless. Hazel took this attention with equanimity. She had never particularly cared what Caldwell thought of her personal choices, and she cared even less now, because the thing taking shape between her and Elias was too carefully tended to be disrupted by public opinion. They were not reckless about it. There were conventions and there was a child to consider, and both of them were people who had been weathered enough to understand the value of taking their time. He did not declare himself in sweeping gestures. She did not dissolve into romantic reverie. What they did was talk endlessly and well, on the porch in the evenings over coffee, during the long Saturday afternoons when he was off duty and Clara was nearby, about everything they had each lived through and wondered about and believed. She told him about the years after Thomas died, the fear, the forced practicality, the grief that had been less like drowning and more like learning to walk differently after an injury. She told him that she had not been unhappy, only lonely in a very specific way. He told her about drifting, about the particular hollow freedom of having nothing to lose, because you have already lost the thing that mattered. He told her about the night in Colorado when he had camped alone in a snow squall and felt so entirely invisible that he had made himself name 5 concrete things about himself that were still true, just to remain solid. He was 36 years old. He was from Missouri. He was good at his work. He knew how to make a decent pot of coffee over an open fire, and he was still alive, which seemed like it ought to count for something. She had listened to this and said, "And then you came here." "And then I came here," he said. "And now you are not invisible," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "I really am not." In June, there was a town social, the kind of spring celebration that Caldwell organized with great enthusiasm and slightly haphazard execution, involving tables of food on the main street and a fiddle player and a great deal of lemonade. Hazel went with Clara, as she had always gone to these events, and she wore her blue dress with the white collar, which was the nicest thing she owned, and which she had not worn since the previous Christmas. Elias found them by the lemonade table, off duty and wearing a clean shirt and actual hat from Not the Trail, and Clara immediately demanded that he try her mother's rye bread, which Hazel had brought and which was, in Clara's estimation, the finest rye bread in the state of Kansas. He tried the rye bread. He confirmed Clara's assessment with full sincerity. Later, when Clara had found a group of schoolmates and the fiddle was playing, and couples were moving on the street in the loose, happy way of country dancing, Elias offered Hazel his hand with a formality that was slightly old-fashioned and entirely genuine. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. She had not danced in 3 years. She thought about saying so, and then thought that saying so would mean not dancing, and she wanted to dance. "Yes," she said. He was not a polished dancer. He moved with the earnest competence of a man who knew the steps and was too self-aware to pretend otherwise, and she was rusty enough that they were evenly matched in their imperfection, which made it comfortable rather than awkward. He kept careful distance between them, appropriate, correct, and his hand at her waist was light, but she was aware of every molecule of it. They danced 2 dances. On the second, toward the end, he leaned close enough to be heard over the music and said, quietly, directly into the vicinity of her ear, "You look very fine tonight, Hazel." She felt the words like sunlight on a cold morning, sudden and total. She did not answer him, because there was no good answer for that in the middle of a public dance, but she thought she probably smiled in a way that said everything that needed saying. July was hot and brilliant and full of work. The wheat came in, and Hazel hired 2 men from town for the harvest back-breaking, necessary, triumphant work. Elias came out on his day off and worked alongside them without fanfare, throwing himself into the physical labor with the thoroughness of a man who had spent enough time idle and preferred to be useful. By the end of the day he was brown with dust and sweat, and Hazel handed him a bucket of well water with the handle, and he dumped half of it over his head without ceremony, and she stood 10 feet away and thought, "There you are. There you are, the actual person." That evening, after the harvest men had gone and Clara was asleep and the farmhouse was full of the good tired quiet of a completed thing, Hazel and Elias sat on the porch in the dark, both of them exhausted, and the silence between them was entirely without effort. After a long while he said, "I want to stay," she said, "then stay." "I mean," he paused, and she could feel him choosing words with care. "I mean I want to stop moving. I want to stay in Caldwell. I want to be near you." Near Clara, she looked at him in the dark. "Is that all you are saying?" He turned to her. Even in the darkness she could see his expression, the careful, wondering look, the one that had been building since April. "No," he said, "it is not all I am saying." "Then say the rest of it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I love you, Hazel." He said it simply, without flourish, with the honesty of a man who has taken a long time to be sure of something and is now entirely sure. "I have loved you since somewhere around the time you walked into a standoff at the livery stable as though it were the most reasonable thing in the world. And I am aware that is not a long time by some measures, but by the measure of how certain I feel about it, it is very long indeed." She looked at him. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady and fast at the same time. "I love you," she said, "and I want you to know that I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it as a response to you saying it first. I say it because it is true, and I have been knowing it was true for a while and deciding whether to trust it." "And you trust it now?" he asked. "I trust it now," she said. He reached out and took her hand, properly this time, with his fingers intertwined with hers, and they sat like that in the warm July dark for a long time, listening to the crickets and the occasional call of a night bird and the sound of the wheat standing still in the windless night. He kissed her for the first time that night. It was not on the porch. She stood up to go inside, and he stood with her, and they were very close in the narrow doorway, and he looked at her with a question in his face, and she answered by staying where she was, and the kiss was careful and unhurried and entirely unlike any of the small romances she had imagined in the abstract in the years of her loneliness. It was simply right. It had the quality of something arriving precisely on time. She went inside and he went home, and the stars were enormous over Kansas, and everything in the world was, for the moment, in its right place. August brought heat that settled over the plains like a hand pressing down. And with the heat came trouble, not the romantic kind, but the practical kind that the Wild West had never stopped producing regardless of people's personal lives. A gang of men who had been raiding farms and way stations to the north of Caldwell had been moving south along the trail, and Caldwell's sheriff had received word from the territory office that they were expected in the area within the week. Sheriff Briggs organized a response with the calm efficiency of a man who had dealt with worse and survived it, and Elias was at the center of it. Hazel did not like it. She did not protest or perform the kind of dramatic anguish that would have been unkind to both of them, but she did not like it, and she told him so with the directness that was her primary emotional register. "I understand the risk," she said. "I also need you to understand that I have a stake in your survival now, and I would appreciate it if you would remember that." He had looked at her with an expression of such startled and grateful warmth that she thought she might have undone him entirely. "Hazel," he said, "I am not asking you not to do your job," she clarified. "I am simply informing you that you are not as expendable as you may have previously believed yourself to be." "I will bear that in mind at every moment," he said. He was careful. The operation to intercept the gang went without the kind of catastrophe that the worst-case imagination conjures. 2 of the men were taken without violence. 2 others were escorted out of the territory by U.S. Marshals who had been riding down from Wichita, and the last scattered north and was not heard from in Caldwell again. Elias came back to the farm on the evening after it was concluded with a small cut on his hand from a wire fence and nothing worse, and Hazel looked at the hand and cleaned it and bandaged it and then stood in her kitchen and breathed very carefully until she had collected herself, and he watched her do this and said nothing because he understood that she needed a moment. "I am fine," she finally said. "I know," he said. "Good," she said. "Sit down. I am making supper." He sat in the spare chair. It was his chair now, the way things become someone's through consistent and honest use, and watched her move around the kitchen, and the evenness of that feeling, the complete rightness of him there, was something that settled into Hazel like good wheat into good soil. September came, and with it, a Sunday afternoon on the bank of the creek that ran south of her property, where the cottonwoods had gone gold at the edges and the water was still warm enough to sit beside. Clara had waded in up to her knees and was conducting some investigation of the creek bottom with the thoroughness of a natural scientist, and Hazel and Elias sat on the bank and watched her, and the afternoon was so entirely beautiful and peaceful that it seemed almost like a different kind of world than the one Hazel had learned to survive. Elias said, "I have been thinking." "About?" she asked. "About the future," he said, "in a specific direction." She looked at him. He was looking at the creek, at Clara, at the gold-edged trees, and there was something in his expression that was both resolved and slightly nervous, which she found endearing. "I was wondering," he said carefully, "whether you would consider marrying me." The words landed with perfect simplicity, and Hazel sat with them for a moment the way you sit with a fire that has just been lit, feeling the warmth arrive slowly and then all at once. "I have considered it," she said. "Have you?" He looked at her now. "For some time," she said. "And," she looked at her daughter in the creek, laughing at something she had found on the bottom. She looked at the cottonwoods. She looked at this man beside her, this careful, honest, steadfast man who had ridden in off the trail and watered his horse at her trough and somehow, in the space of a year, become the person she most wanted to talk to about every thought she had. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Elias." He let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for a while. And then the full smile came, not the careful, rationed version, but the real one, the wide and unguarded one that made him look like someone had removed a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was there. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she confirmed, "though I should tell you that Clara will have opinions." As if on cue, Clara looked up from the creek bed. "Opinions about what?" she called. Hazel and Elias looked at each other with identical expressions of contained amusement. "Come out of the creek," Hazel said. "We have something to tell you." Clara waded to the bank and sat beside them, wet-footed and attentive, and Elias told her, simply and directly, that he had asked her mother to marry him and she had said yes, and that he would very much like her permission and her blessing, if she was willing to give it. Clara looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating gaze of an 8-year-old who takes things seriously. "Will you still fix the fence when it needs fixing?" she asked. "Whenever it needs it," he said. "And will you stay?" she asked. "Not just visit and go, stay." "If your mother will have me," he said. "I intend to stay for the rest of my life." Clara thought about this. "All right," she said. "I give my permission." Elias said with great solemnity, "Thank you, Miss Clara." Clara immediately returned to the creek to retrieve whatever she had found, and Hazel and Elias sat on the bank, and the afternoon continued to be golden, and the cottonwoods continued their slow, gorgeous change, and everything in the world was in its right place. They were married in October, a year almost to the day from when Elias had first ridden up to Hazel's fence line looking exhausted and lost. The wedding was in the church in Caldwell, which Hazel attended more warmly now than she ever had before, and the preacher, who still sometimes made her feel like a half-finished sentence, managed on this occasion to say the right words. The congregation was small. Sheriff Briggs and his wife, Mabel Greer, and her herald, Ezra Potts, who had recovered from his cough and was present in his Sunday best with his hat held reverentially against his chest, Fern Albright from the boarding house, young Caleb Potts, a dozen other neighbors and townspeople, and in the front row Clara, wearing the dress with the yellow ribbons that Hazel had stayed up 2 nights to finish. Hazel wore a dress the color of autumn sage, not white, because she had been married before and she was not pretending otherwise, and the dress was beautiful in a quieter way. She carried wild asters from the field, because they were what was blooming, and she walked into the church without being walked in by anyone because she was a woman who had walked her own road for 3 years, and she knew how to do that. Elias was already at the front of the church, in a dark coat that was the best thing he owned, standing with the straightness of a man who has decided to be present for every moment of something. When she came down the aisle, he watched her with an expression so open and direct that it was almost difficult to look at like looking at the sun, except that it was warm without being blinding. The vows were spoken. The rings exchanged. Hers was a simple gold band, no filigree, exactly what she wanted. When the preacher said what he was required to say about the kissing of the bride, Elias kissed her with the same quiet, unhurried certainty that characterized everything he did, and Clara cheered in the front row with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a child who has decided something is wonderful. After the ceremony, there was a proper dinner at the Sutton farmhouse, now the Carver farmhouse, though she would go on calling it the Sutton farmhouse in her own head for a while, simply out of habit. Mabel Greer brought 3 pies, which was Mabel at her most expressive. Sheriff Briggs made a toast that was brief and genuine. Ezra Potts told a story about Thomas Sutton that made everyone laugh, and then made Hazel cry a little, which she did not try to hide, because she was a woman who had loved before and was not ashamed of it. And Elias, beside her, took her hand under the table and held it until she was steady. After the guests had gone and Clara was put to bed, Hazel and Elias stood in the kitchen together for the first time as husband and wife, and the farmhouse was entirely quiet around them. The lamp burned on the table. The spare chair, his chair now, sat at its place. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man who is fully, completely, and contentedly in the right place. "I will be very happy here," he said. "You already are," she said, because she could see it in every part of him. "I already am," he agreed and smiled. That night, for the first time in 3 years, the farmhouse felt exactly the right size. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was the kind of winter that would be talked about for years, deep cold, enough snow to make the roads impassable for weeks at a time, the kind of enforced closeness that tested partnerships thoroughly. Hazel and Elias were tested and came through it with something stronger than they had started with. There were small disputes about the way he organized the tool shed, too precisely, in her view, because she had a system that looked like disorder but was in fact extremely functional. about the way she took on responsibilities without asking for help, too many in his view, because he was standing right there and perfectly capable. They argued about these things in the particular way of two people who are arguing about something that is actually just the process of learning to share a life, with emotion and directness and eventual resolution, and at least once, genuine laughter in the middle of the argument, when one of them said something so perfectly accurate and unexpected that they both had to stop being exasperated. She thought, during one of these arguments, about how different it was from her marriage to Thomas. Not worse, not better in some hierarchical way, but different because she was a different person now, and Elias was a different person from Thomas, and a marriage between different people in different circumstances was naturally its own particular thing. Thomas had been her first love, the one that had shaped her. Elias was her chosen love, the one she walked toward with full knowledge of what love could cost and what it could give and what it required, and she chose it anyway. By spring, they had worked out most of the tool shed argument to mutual satisfaction, and the hell-pasking argument was an ongoing negotiation that she suspected would never fully resolve, which was fine because it meant they always had something real to talk about. In April of 1879, Hazel realized she was pregnant. She told Elias on a Sunday morning before Clara was up, in the kitchen over coffee. She told him the way she told him most important things directly, without ornamentation, watching his face. His face went through several things very quickly: surprise, a deep, immediate joy, a careful, concerned love directed entirely at her, and then a helpless, enormous happiness that he clearly had no idea what to do with. "Hazel," he said. "Yes," she said. Are you well? Are you feeling?" "I feel fine," she said. "I have done this before, I know what to expect." "What do you need?" he asked. "I need you to stop looking at me as though I have just performed a miracle," she said, which was slightly undermined by the fact that she was smiling. "You have," he said simply. Clara received the news with characteristic directness. "I would like a brother," she announced. "Girls are quite common." Hazel and Elias did their best to explain that these things were not matters of preference, which Clara acknowledged with the patient skepticism of a child who suspects adults are holding back information. The pregnancy was ordinary in all the ways that mattered. There were morning weeks that were difficult. There was the summer heat that was unkind. There was the particular exhaustion of growing a person while also running a farm. Elias took on more of the physical work without being asked, and without making a production of it, which she appreciated enormously. He drove her into town for her appointments with Dr. Garrett, who had been Caldwell's physician for 11 years and had the reassuringly matter-of-fact manner of a man who had seen everything twice. He sat on the porch with her in the evenings when she was too tired for much else, and he read aloud to her from the newspaper, and from the novel she had found in the Mercantile, a Scott novel, not her usual fare, but good enough to carry them through 2 months of evenings. In November of 1879, their son was born. He was born at the farmhouse, as Clara had been, with Dr. Garrett in attendance and Mabel Greer, who had appointed herself midwife for the occasion, and was, Hazel would admit this to herself, genuinely competent and steadying. Elias was in the kitchen, as was the custom and the medical recommendation, and Hazel could hear him there moving, being still, moving again, and the sound of him being there was its own kind of medicine. The boy arrived at 2 in the morning, loud and insistent, and when Dr. Garrett placed him in Hazel's arms she looked at him, red-faced and furious about the indignity of being born, dark-haired like her, with a stubbornness about the jaw that she suspected came from both sides, and felt the specific, annihilating love of a parent seeing a child for the first time. Elias was brought in. He stood in the lamplight looking at his son with the expression of a man who has been surprised by life in the best possible way, and his eyes were bright in the way that men's eyes get when they are not crying but are very close to it and have decided to pretend otherwise. "Hello," he said to the baby with great seriousness. "I am your father." The baby looked at him. Or rather, the baby looked at approximately his direction with the unfocused gaze of the newly arrived. "He has your nose," Hazel told him. "God help him," Elias said. She laughed, which was not the response she had anticipated having 90 seconds after giving birth, but there it was. They named him Thomas Elias Carver. Thomas for the man who had been first, who had built the foundation of this life and this family and this farm. Elias because he was his father's son. It seemed right to carry both names, and when Hazel said it aloud for the first time, Thomas Elias Carver, it sounded like something that had been waiting to be said. Clara, presented with her brother in the morning, looked at him for a long time. "He is very small," she said. "He will get bigger," Elias said. "He looks like he is angry about something," Clara said. "He is adjusting," Hazel said. "Will he be able to help with the wheat eventually?" "In perhaps 10 years," Elias said. Clara looked at the math of this. "That is a very long wait," she said. "Many worthwhile things require a long wait," Hazel said. And she caught Elias' eye across the room, and the look between them was so full of private meaning, and shared history and mutual recognition, that it was its own complete language. The winter of 1879 was the first winter they were 4 rather than 2.5, and it was warm in all the ways a winter can be warm without changing its temperature. Little Thomas, who turned out to be exactly as stubborn as his jaw had suggested, was a baby of enormous opinions and enthusiastic expressions, which Clara found fascinating, and which kept Elias and Hazel up more nights than they had anticipated and laughing about it more than they would have thought possible. The farmhouse, which was, by now, the Carver farmhouse in Hazel's own head as well, though she still tended Thomas Sutton's grave on the rise with the same care she always had, because some things are not replaced, but simply joined by new things, was full in a way it had never been in the long, quiet years of her widowhood. Full of voices and boots at the door, and the smell of coffee, and Elias' habit of whistling very quietly when he was doing something with his hands, a habit he was entirely unaware of, and which Hazel found profoundly dear. 1880 arrived, and with it a spring that was generous even by Kansas standards. The wheat came in beautifully that year, the best harvest Hazel had seen since before Thomas died, and the farm flourished under the combined attention of 2 capable adults who had a genuine investment in making things grow. Elias negotiated a modest but real salary increase from the county, and they used part of it to extend the front porch and part of it to buy a proper cradle for Thomas, who had outgrown the crib, and part of it to order Clara a proper set of school books from back east, because she was, it had become clear, an exceptionally intelligent child who was going to need more than the Caldwell school could provide. On the matter of Clara's education, Hazel had opinions, and Elias had the good sense to share them. They spent several evenings discussing options and wrote 3 letters, and received 2 useful responses, and ultimately arranged for Clara to receive additional tutoring from the wife of a new schoolmaster who had arrived in Caldwell in the spring. A woman named Mrs. Holt, who had been educated in Boston and had a genuine gift for teaching, and who was, Hazel thought, exactly the right person for Clara at exactly the right time. Clara took to the additional lessons with the intensity of someone who has found the thing they were waiting for. She came home from her lessons talking, and Hazel let her talk about history, about literature, about mathematics, about the nature of things, and watched her daughter become more fully herself with every week, and felt the specific pride of a parent witnessing a person's unfolding. In the summer of 1880, Mabel Greer, who had been gloating in her particular restrained fashion about her role in the Carver family's happiness for the better part of 2 years, came to visit and sat at Hazel's kitchen table and drank her coffee, and then looked at the table's end and said, "The chair is still there." "It is," Hazel agreed. The spare chair had never been removed. It was Elias' chair now. He sat in it every evening at supper, every morning at breakfast, but Hazel had kept it where it had always been, at the end of the table opposite her own. "Is it still a spare chair?" Mabel asked. She was not being unkind. She was being Mabel, genuinely curious, socially blunt, fundamentally good-hearted. Hazel thought about this. She looked at the chair, which still had the slightly worn seat and the four steady legs, which had been repaired twice now by Elias because one leg had developed a wobble that he found unacceptable and had addressed with the thoroughness he brought to all things. "No," she said, "it is not a spare chair anymore." "When did it stop being spare?" Mabel asked. "The night I put a plate there," Hazel said. "The night I invited him to sit." Mabel was quiet for a moment, which was rare. "You knew then?" she asked. "I knew something," Hazel said. "I knew it was time to stop leaving space for the possibility of something and start making room for the actual thing." Mabel nodded slowly. "That is a very sensible thing," she said. "I can occasionally manage sensible," Hazel said. They laughed, and Hazel refilled the coffee. And outside, the summer went on doing what it had always done, hot and golden and purposeful. And in the next room, little Thomas was conducting some investigation of his own. And somewhere down the field, Elias was mending the south fence again. And Clara was at her tutoring in town. And the farmhouse hummed with the specific harmony of a life that had, against the considerable odds of grief and solitude and the unrelenting demands of the frontier, been made whole. On the evening of that same day, when supper was done and Thomas was finally asleep after considerable negotiation, and Clara was at the table with her books, Hazel and Elias sat on the extended front porch in the warm Kansas darkness. The stars were performing their usual extravagance overhead. The wheat stood in the dark fields, and the cottonwood on the rise whispered in a slight wind, and somewhere in the distance the lights of Caldwell flickered against the sky. "I have been thinking," Hazel said. "About?" he asked. He was leaning back in his chair with his legs stretched out, a cup of coffee balanced on his knee with the practiced ease of a man who had drunk a lot of coffee in a lot of postures. "About how different things are," she said, "from 3 years ago. 3 years ago you pointed a traveler to the town and told him his horse needed water," he said. "I did," she said. "And now you are stuck with him," he said. "I am not stuck," she said. "I chose." "You keep choosing," he said, "every day." He said it with the simple observation of a man who notices everything and does not take anything for granted. "So do you," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it that first time on the porch, with his fingers interlaced with hers, without ceremony, completely naturally. "I choose every day," he said, "very willingly." The night spread out around them, enormous and quiet and full of the small sounds of a living farm, the horses in the barn, the chickens settling, the cottonwood, the crickets. Clara's lamp burned in the window. Thomas would be up in 4 hours demanding attention, and Hazel was trying not to think about this. "Do you ever think about Missouri?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Less now. Is that all right?" He considered the question, which was one of the things she loved about him. He considered questions rather than deflecting them. "Yes," he said. "I think Anna would have wanted me to have less reason to think about her in the way I used to. The kind of thinking that was about absence. She was a good person. She would have wanted me to be here." "Thomas would have wanted me to be here too," Hazel said. "He was always very reasonable." "It sounds like they would have liked each other," Elias said. "It does," she agreed. "It is a strange thought." "Yes," he said, "but a good one." The night moved gently around them, and they were quiet for a while. And the quiet was entirely without edge or effort, the kind of quiet that two people arrive at only after they have said all the necessary things and found that the space between the words is just as good. "Next spring," Hazel said. "What about next spring?" he asked. "I would like to plant an apple tree," she said, "on the north side of the house where the soil is good. I have been meaning to do it for years." "Then we will plant an apple tree," he said. "They take time," she said, "several years before they produce anything." "I am not going anywhere," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He shifted slightly to accommodate her, without interrupting either the coffee or the posture, with the practiced ease of a man who had made space for another person and had no intention of making anything difficult about it. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." The apple tree was planted in March of 1881. on a cold, clear morning when the soil was just soft enough to work. And Clara helped with the digging and pronounced the process educational. And Thomas, now a year and some months and fully mobile and firmly opinionated, did his best to assist and was gently redirected 3 times from the hole and eventually settled for sitting beside it and patting the dirt with great satisfaction. Elias set the sapling in the ground with careful attention, packing the soil around the roots with his hands, and Hazel knelt beside him and helped, and their hands worked the same cold earth together, and the pale March sun was overhead, and the farm stretched out around them in all directions, the wheat fields, the fence lines, the barn, the house with the porch. And above the rise the cottonwood stood bare-branched against the sky, patient as it had always been. When the tree was planted and the soil packed and the first water given, Elias sat back on his heels and looked at the small sapling with its thin branches and its promise. "What do you think?" he asked Clara. "I think it needs several years," she said. "It does," he agreed. "But it will be worth it?" she asked. He looked at Hazel. She looked at him. The specific, private, complete look that had been developing between them since a July night on a porch 3 years ago, when everything that was going to happen had been just beginning to be visible on the horizon. "It will absolutely be worth it," he said. They went inside for coffee, all 4 of them, into the kitchen where the table was set for lunch and the spare chair, Elias' chair, Thomas Elias Carver's father's chair, the chair that had waited at the table's end for 3 years and had finally found its person, sat where it had always sat, at the far end opposite Hazel's, no longer spare in any sense of the word but simply and completely belonging. The stove was warm. The coffee was on. Outside, the March wind moved across the Kansas plains with its usual impartial grandeur. And inside the farmhouse, the family that had assembled itself out of loss and courage and patience, and a spare chair, and the willingness of 2 people to keep a place at the table for something they could not yet see, that family had lunched together, loudly and happily, and with Thomas making his opinions known about everything, and the afternoon settled around them like a second porch, like a second sky. Like all the good things that come to the people who refuse to stop making room for them. The apple tree, as it turned out, produced its first fruit in the autumn of 1885. The apples were small that first year and very tart, the way first things often are, a little raw, a little rough around the edges, wanting refinement. But they made an exceptional pie. Hazel made 3 of them on the day of the first harvest and set them on the porch to cool, and the smell of them carried across the yard, and Clara, who was 15 by then and almost entirely a young woman, said that she thought they were the best thing she had ever smelled. And Thomas, 5 years old and entirely himself, which was to say loud and curious and deeply committed to justice, ate an entire apple straight off the tree and declared it perfect. And Elias, coming in from the fields with the dust of the day on his coat, stopped at the porch steps and inhaled, and looked at Hazel with the particular expression that was, after 7 years of marriage, still the one that made her feel most seen. "You planned ahead," he said. "I always plan ahead," she said. "That is one of the many things I love about you," he said. She handed him a piece of pie, still warm, and he sat on the porch steps and ate it with the contentment of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to be. And the autumn was gold and red around the farm, and the cottonwood on the rise had gone its magnificent October color, and the life that Hazel Sutton had built first from grief, then from patience, then from a single deliberate act of setting a plate at a chair that had been empty too long, was full and vivid and entirely real. That evening, with the children fed and Clara at her books and Thomas finally asleep, Hazel and Elias sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and 2 cups of coffee, and the quiet that they had made together out of all the years of choosing. She looked at him across the table, this man who had come off the Chisholm Trail on a tired horse and found his way, by some grace of chance or intention or the particular mercy of the universe, to her fence line. This man who listened, who stayed, who had planted an apple tree and mended her fences and sat in the spare chair and made it his own. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked it the way she asked it sometimes, not from doubt, but from the genuine desire to know, to hear it said, because she thought happiness was worth acknowledging aloud in the specific moments when it was present. He looked at her across the lamp and the coffee and the kitchen that smelled of apples and the table that had always had a place set for the right person. "Completely," he said. "Entirely. Yes." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and outside the Kansas night spread its extravagant stars across the dark, and the spare chair was full, and the table was set, and everything that had needed to be built had been built, and everything that had needed to be healed had been healed, and the life that had once seemed like it might remain perpetually three-quarters finished turned out to be, in the end, as whole as anything could be. Full of love and work and children and apple pie, and the steady, unspectacular, magnificent devotion of two people who had both lost the world once and found the courage, despite everything, to build a new one.